Hello and welcome. I am so glad that you are attending this session on the topic of setting limits and managing expectations in the workplace. My name is Chrissy Scivicque, and I am the founder of eatyourcareer.com, which I realize is a very odd sounding name. But Eat Your Career is all about creating a nourishing professional life, which is something I believe in deeply. I love helping people understand what that means for them because it's different for everyone. And it's my joy in life to help people create their nourishing career path. So today's topic is really an essential part of that, which I think you'll see as we move forward here. But first, I do want to take just a few minutes to introduce myself a little bit more before we jump into things. Again, my name is Chrissy Scivicque, and I realize that last name can look a little complicated and intimidating, but it's actually very simple. It's pronounced similar to a Honda Civic, which is right there in the middle. So just think about that and ignore all the extra letters. This is a picture of me on stage at APC, the Administrative Professionals Conference, which is one of the largest conferences in the world for administrative professionals. I was honored to be the MC there in 2016, and I just love this picture because I feel like I'm channeling my inner Tony Robbins, and I'm about to ask everyone in the audience to walk across coals with their bare feet. But thankfully, we didn't do that at this particular conference. So why am I qualified to talk to you on the topic of setting limits and managing expectations? Well, first of all, I am a certified career coach. I work with job seekers, career changers, and career advancers. And I often work with people when they're in a state of burnout. We'll talk a little bit more about burnout later on, but basically it's a consequence of not effectively setting limits and managing expectations. So my clients often have to learn new patterns of behavior to help them overcome burnout and to make sure it doesn't happen again in the future. I'm also a corporate trainer. I've developed and delivered custom training and development programs for a variety of organizations, including those ones you see at the bottom of the screen there, Capital One, GoDaddy, Ball Aerospace, and many, many more. I'm the creator of a program called Elevate Admins, which is a comprehensive on-site training and coaching program specifically for career-minded administrative professionals. And today's session is actually one of the topics that we go into in depth in that program. I'm also the author of The Proactive Professional, How to Stop Playing Catch Up and Start Getting Ahead at Work and in Life. And that's all about doing the right things today to set yourself up for success tomorrow. Managing expectations is certainly a part of that. It's a very proactive practice. Again, I think you'll see that as we move forward here. Finally, I am a career expert for U.S. News and World Report, as well as a variety of other print and online publications. So now that you've seen my name once, you might notice it popping up in all sorts of places. I'm always out there talking about strategies for advancing your career and achieving that concept of professional nourishment. So this is just a small taste of the things that I do in the world of professional development and career advancement. But before all of this, I too was an administrative professional. This is probably my most important qualification for talking about this topic. I am a very proud former administrative professional. I spent years in various positions that were admin in nature, and then I became an executive assistant, which is where my career really took off, and then it eventually took a drastic change, and I transitioned into professional development and coaching. Now, this session is all about managing your workload, staying committed to high standards without verging into impossible standards territory. I know from my own experience as an assistant that so much gets tossed at you on a daily basis. It's really one of those jobs where you can't predict what any given day will be like. You can walk into the office in the morning and you think you know what your priorities are, but then 5 new things are thrown at you by 9 a.m. and then you have to completely adjust your plans. I get that. It really is a position where you have to have a lot of agility and adaptability. But even more than that, it also requires setting limits and managing expectations. And here's why. It's very easy for people to just believe that us assistants can do it all. In the past few years, more and more we hear admins are referred to as superheroes. And I realize that that's supposed to be kind of this nice term of endearment, but it's a very dangerous trap for us to fall into. We even fall into it ourselves. We envision ourselves to be practically superhuman. We can take on anything and everything. We get a request and we immediately say yes, because that's what assistants do. We'll figure out a way. We are superheroes. And that's great, but it's also dangerous because we're human. If we're not careful, we can end up overloaded, overwhelmed, and underwater. And when that happens, we can't perform at peak levels. We end up missing deadlines or letting things fall through the cracks, or we hit burnout. And we have trouble keeping up with things because we're not really managing what's coming at us. We're just taking orders from everyone around us. As much as we would all love to give an unconditional yes to every request that comes our way, it's just not feasible. It's not realistic. If we want to be exceptional assistants, we have to take an active role in managing expectations. The truth is, we all have limits. I've identified 6 specific types of limits, so let's go through these. First off, we have physical limits. I am only one person and I only have 2 hands. I can't be in 2 different places at once, right? That's why I don't double book myself. That's just a physical limitation that I have to work within. Most of us are really comfortable with this. If you have an appointment on the calendar for 11 a.m. and someone wants to book time with you at 11, you're probably very comfortable setting a limit and countering and giving them another option because you know it's not possible to be in 2 places at once. We also have mental limits. We can't think about 10 different things at one time and give all 10 things our attention. We have mental limitations. As much as we would like to think that we can multitask, I know that's a really popular term and everybody thinks they can do it exceptionally well, but we really can't do it. When we split our attention, our performance and our comprehension are negatively impacted. All the research shows this. We do have certain mental limitations. We can't think about everything all at once, or we have no clarity at all. We also have emotional limits. We have these, but a lot of people don't respect them. We've all been through really challenging personal times, I'm sure. And, if you've ever lost a loved one, or if you've ever gone through a really messy breakup, or you've struggled with your kids, and then you go to work, one small thing can send you over the emotional edge because you've just reached your limit. Your cup is full and you add one more drop on top of it, you're going to spill over. That's emotional limitation, and it's a very real, very valid thing. We also have time limitations. We only have 24 hours in a day. We all want to make more hours, but it's just not happening. We have limits to the number of things that we can possibly accomplish in any given period. Most of us work an 8-hour workday. I think some of us work a little overtime, and that's okay. We can go up to maybe 9, 10 hours in a workday. But if you start pushing it over that, you're really starting to drain yourself mentally, emotionally, and physically because now you're starting to stretch your time limits. And finally, we have limits of energy and attention. If we're not taking care of ourselves in all of these areas, our ability to remain energized throughout the day and our ability to give proper attention to the things around us absolutely diminishes. And the reason why we have these limits is because we are human. We are not superhuman. These are real limitations that we have to deal with. When we don't deal with them, we suffer some major consequences. We create all kinds of problems for ourselves when we ignore our limits. It's like we have set up the dominoes and then we just push one of them over and there's this whole chain reaction. So here are just a few of the dangers that we encounter when we don't respect our limits. First, we end up with higher levels of stress and fatigue. For most of us, what we really want to do is create a sustainable career for ourselves, a career where we can remain energized and healthy and able to contribute to the best of our ability over the long term. But when we don't take care of ourselves in that process, then that can't happen. We end up mentally, physically, emotionally exhausted, and that's what burnout is all about. I had someone in my training class a few months ago, and she said to me, Chrissy, I never manage expectations or set limits. If something has to be done, I'm just going to find a way to do it. I'll stay late, I'll work weekends, it doesn't matter, I will get it done. She had just decided that she was going to do everything that was asked of her without question, without regard for the consequences. And so she said this to me in a training class, and there was a part of me that on the one hand, I really respected her drive and her ambition. I saw that. But a bigger part of me said that's absolutely short-sighted because it's not sustainable. It cannot last. I want all of you to recognize that so that you can make some minor adjustments that are comfortable for you and are comfortable for the people around you and that still allow you to be a star performer, but that also allow you to create a sustainable career. When we don't respect our limits, we also have much greater risk of failure. If you're just saying yes to everything that comes your way and you're not thinking it through and you're not making sure that it's something you can really deliver on, your chances of failure are enormous. And when things fall through the cracks and you can't keep your promises, ultimately your reputation and your credibility will be damaged in that process. And those things are incredibly difficult to earn back. So if you agree that we are all human, and as humans we do have limits, then the next thing we have to do is take responsibility for that. We are responsible for 3 different things. First, we're responsible for understanding what those limits are and how they impact our ability to deliver. We're also responsible for expressing our limits clearly so we can set appropriate expectations with others. And finally, we're responsible for managing those limits so we can effectively follow through on our commitments. We're the only ones that can do this for ourselves. No one else knows everything that's on your plate. We're the only ones who can say, you know what? If you add another thing to my pile, something is going to have to be rearranged here. Only we can see that. So we have to be able to manage everything that comes at us within the constraints of our human limitations. Now, often when I hear people talk about setting limits in the workplace, they use a shorthand and they call it saying no. But here's the problem with that. People don't like to hear no. It is very rarely well accepted in the workplace. People hear the word no and they immediately feel on edge. They hear you say that word and they think that you are stubborn, or that you're not a team player, or that you're unwilling to do your job. So I want to be very clear here that I'm not talking about saying no to legitimate requests that are made of you. The only time you should say no is if someone is asking you to do something that is unethical or illegal or something that's totally outside the scope of your authority. So, for example, if you were asked to sign a check and you don't have signing authority on that account, then clearly that's a request that you can say no to. The truth is, every job description on the planet includes a very subtle phrase somewhere in it that goes something like this: and other duties as assigned. So the tasks that fall into the scope of your role can quite literally be almost anything. So no isn't really an acceptable response to a legitimate request at work. But again, you have human limitations. You only have so much time and so much capacity. So how do you deal with those limits without actually saying the word no? Well, it's a process of negotiation. And I use a tool that I've actually broken down, and I call it the 4 C's. The 4 C's represent 4 steps of this process. So when someone brings you a request that's potentially going to push you past your limits, these are the steps that you can go through to manage the situation and renegotiate the expectations so you can successfully deliver. So let's go through each one of these steps in detail. Step number 1 is clarify. Make sure you understand what is being asked of you. I think that too often people very quickly say yes to requests, and then later they realize that there's more to it than they thought, or they didn't really understand what was all involved. They didn't have everything they need, and then suddenly they realize that this request is going to take much longer than they originally expected. So when someone makes a request, you can't give an honest answer if you don't have all the facts first. You want to verify that you really understand everything involved. So for example, if my boss has just explained to me something that he would like me to work on, I would repeat it back to him and I would say, okay, you need a PowerPoint presentation. It has to have 100 slides in it. You want it to be flashy with great graphics and transitions and animations, and you need all of that done by the end of today. Is that right? So what I'm doing here is just clarifying, making sure that I understand what's being asked of me. Step 2 is to counter. Once you really understand what's being asked and you feel like it's something that pushes you past your maximum capacity, or it's simply an unrealistic time frame or expectation, then you can counter the request. So this means that you're offering an alternative expectation and you're focusing on what you can do, not what you can't, based on your existing limitation, whether that's your workload or the amount of time you have or whatever. So you might be offering a new deadline, or you might be offering some revised outcomes, for example. If we go back to the example that I just gave with the 100-slide PowerPoint presentation, then you might counter back with something like this. You might say, okay, instead of getting this to you by the end of today, would it be possible to have a few days to work on this? Or if you need it by the end of today, could we reduce the number of slides? Or would it be okay if you didn't have all the bells and whistles and you just had kind of minimal graphics? What I'm doing here is I'm opening up a negotiation process. Now remember that when you do this, you have to be able to meet the new expectation that you just set. You can't counter and then fail to meet your own expectations. So be realistic and set something that's attainable for yourself. Sometimes it's also useful to offer some kind of an explanation about why you're countering. So you might want to talk about the existing priorities on your plate. So for example, if your executive is asking you to do something this afternoon and you have a deadline on another project that really needs your attention, explain that. Let them know, hey, I'm working on ABC project this afternoon. Does it make sense to push that to tomorrow so I can work on this instead? You're just posing the question. Obviously, you can only do this if you know what your priorities are. You have to know what you're working with. And you can only do this if you've been on top of things. You can't recommend a counter on one task because you've procrastinated on another task and now that one's an emergency. So you're suggesting an alternative expectation. You're now in this negotiation process. What happens in negotiation? Most of the time, people counter back. It would be fantastic if we could just suggest something different and they would always accept it right off the bat. But that usually doesn't happen. So that brings us to step 3, which is compromise. Identify a way forward that will meet the needs of the person making the request and also ensure that you're able to deliver. It can't be something that pushes you past your human limits. You have to be able to deliver on what you promise. It does no good to tell people that you can deliver something and then fail to do it. In fact, it only does harm, right? It hurts your reputation, it hurts the relationship, it hurts the work itself. It's also okay to say, I'll get back to you on this. It's totally acceptable to postpone making a commitment and give yourself a little bit of time just to reevaluate your priorities. You might have to discuss the situation. If it's someone besides your executive who's making the request, you might want to talk to your executive about it. You might want to talk to another person on your team and they can help you figure out the best way forward. So remember that this is a process of negotiation. Always make sure that you're really clear that you want to find a way to make it work for everyone involved, but still be firm, be polite in your discussions, sort of use your best professional etiquette as you're embarking on this negotiation process. And finally, the last C in the process is confirm. Reiterate what was agreed upon, if possible, in writing. It's very easy for people to get mixed up when you're going back and forth, and it's easy for miscommunications to happen. Or people just forget what they agreed to. So don't leave it to chance and don't rely on them using their memory. Make sure that you're clear on what you're going to be delivering by sending some sort of follow-up. I like to recommend sending an email follow-up after some sort of a conversation where you've just renegotiated expectations. Send an email with something very simple. As we discussed, I'm going to put together a PowerPoint presentation with 50 slides for you by the end of the day tomorrow. Right? That way, there's no confusion. You have a record of everything that you agreed to. And if there is a problem, if there was some sort of a miscommunication, it can be caught very quickly. One strategy that can be really helpful in this process is to make your priorities visible, meaning that you have a very clear list of what you're working on that other people can see. If you're visually demonstrating what's on your plate, then that helps other people to see exactly what would have to be shuffled around to meet their expectations. So again, if your boss wants that presentation done today, you could easily point to your visible task list and say, here's what I have on my plate for today. Does this take priority over all of these other things? I used to do this when I was an executive assistant, and I can tell you, my executive got to a point where he actually really managed himself on these things. That list would just help keep him in check. It would stop him from labeling everything as an A number one priority because he could see all of the other A number one priorities. He'd look at that list and he would start to do the math himself, and he would ask himself, is this really a priority that takes precedence? And if so, what am I willing to sacrifice to get this done? So I recommend that you grab a dry erase board and you put it on the wall and you use that to track the most pressing items on your plate. It doesn't have to capture absolutely everything, but it's those main priorities. And when someone gives you something and says, this has to go at the top of the list, make sure they understand exactly what's on that list and what that means. It's a really effective and easy way to get other people to respect your limits and to ultimately manage their own expectations. I think it's also worthwhile to note that sometimes, even after you have attempted to renegotiate expectations and you've gone through those 4 steps in the 4C process, sometimes the original parameters still stand and you have no choice but to try to make it work somehow. So for example, if my boss needed a 100-slide PowerPoint presentation and he wanted all the bells and whistles and it had to be done by the end of today, I tried to renegotiate and he said, sorry, it is what it is. You've got to make it work. Well, at that point, I have to think about other options, other ways to make this work. I've tried my best to manage the expectation. It didn't happen. So now I have to figure out a way that I can meet his expectations given my human limitations. So maybe at that point I can ask a colleague for some help to get it done. Or maybe I can try to delegate some of my other priorities for the day so I can focus just solely on that PowerPoint presentation. I'm just going to have to do my best with what I have at that point. That's the nature of the job sometimes as an assistant. I'm sure you all know that. So I always recommend that you utilize your team as much as possible to be able to deliver on things if and when they're stretching you past your points of limitation. Talk to your other assistants, talk to your coworkers, and see if you can somehow split responsibilities, see if there's things that they can take over for you so you can focus on what's most pressing. You're not always going to be able to shift expectations, but I believe that if you're proactively managing them, then it should really only be on occasion that you have to do real scrambling to meet crazy expectations. And from time to time, sure, you can work late. You can work a weekend to get it done and make it work. I get that, but it shouldn't be a pattern. Remember, we want to create a sustainable career for ourselves, something that can last for the long term. And we don't want that to be a pattern. It won't be a pattern if you're actively trying to set limits, you're actively trying to manage expectations along the way, and you're just kind of doing your best, then at least some portion of the time, you should be able to negotiate things to a place where it's very manageable for you. I always like to be clear when I'm doing this kind of training that I do firmly believe that admins are absolutely amazing. I know that each and every one of you make the impossible happen every day. I know that anything is possible when you put your mind to it. But I also know that there's a cost to that. When we accept unreasonable expectations, we sacrifice a lot to make that happen. I don't want you to sacrifice your well-being or your mental, physical, or emotional health. I don't want you to sacrifice your reputation and your credibility in order to get impossible things done. I want you instead to recognize your ability to influence the situation. You can take an active role in managing expectations and setting appropriate limits for yourself. And if you use that step-by-step process that you just learned, you can do it in a way that still allows you to be a top performer and even an office superhero. Now, before we wrap up, I also just want to quickly address another component of this topic, and that is setting limits with regards to behavior. When it comes to our interpersonal dynamics in the workplace, those emotional limits that we were talking about earlier are very important. And as we've been talking about, we have to respect those limits, but we also have to train other people to respect them as well. Everyone has different emotional limits. What pushes me over the edge might not be the same thing that pushes you over the edge, which is why we have to be clear with other people. They won't always just know what behaviors are problematic for you. I am a firm believer that we teach people how to treat us by showing them what we're willing to accept. This is a really famous concept, and I think it originally came from Maya Angelou, but it's been restated so many times in a variety of different ways. I think I first heard it from Oprah myself, but it's so true. I also think that in the workplace, we have to be willing to accept that people have quirks and people have bad days. And we're not going to be best friends with everyone. And that's perfectly okay. We have to be flexible and allow people to be their own uniquely flawed version of who they are. And at the same time, we have to be strong enough to address patterns of problematic behavior that impede our ability to perform well. So if someone is doing something that pushes you past your emotional limits, it's your responsibility to very clearly articulate that. And believe me, I understand that this is really hard. I am sure we've all been through it. I know that I've personally experienced it in the past with my boss. Most of us try to just ignore it when our emotional limits are being stepped on because it's so uncomfortable to address. But again, it's not sustainable. Eventually, we reach a breaking point, and that breaking point can actually make the situation much worse. We want to avoid that by taking an active role in setting limits and managing expectations with others. So here's how we do that. Once again, I have a 4-step process for you. By now, you can probably guess that I'm a big fan of list making and simplifying. I like to make this stuff as easy as possible. And honestly, I think sometimes we overcomplicate this stuff, which is why I like to just break it down into its most simple components. These are the steps that you need to take when you want to teach people some new behaviors. First, address it after the emotion has passed, but as close to the time of the incident as possible. So when you're feeling emotional, it's really easy to say things that aren't helpful. I'm sure you've all experienced that in the past. Or to say things in a way that people don't really hear. It's easier for them to write it off, as someone who's just having an emotional outburst. So let the emotion dissipate and then approach the person. Step number 2 is to state the unacceptable behavior. They need to know exactly what isn't working for you. It needs to be as clearly defined as possible. I think that these days, a lot of people use the word bullying as a catch-all for bad behavior. But that's problematic because it's just too vague. It doesn't tell the person exactly what they're doing. And that word bullying has a lot of stigma attached to it. So I recommend that you get much more precise in how you're defining the problem. Step number 3 is to state the new acceptable behavior. So what do you want them to do instead? Again, be specific. And then step number 4 is to ask for agreement. So altogether, all 4 steps might sound something like this. Yesterday I was really upset when you yelled at me in front of the team. Next time, I'd appreciate it if we could have those kinds of conversations behind closed doors. Can we agree to that? Super simple, really clear. Now again, this is something I would only address if it were a pattern of behavior. I prefer to pick my battles at work. I recognize that everyone makes mistakes. Most people know when they've made a mistake. But if it's a reoccurring situation, I'm not going to beat around the bush. These are the steps that you can take to just make it incredibly clear. So that example that I just gave you there, is from my own personal experience. This was the exact situation that I had to address with my superior, with the executive that I was supporting. Too many times in a row, he had yelled at me in front of large groups of people. And so my request was that, when we have to have those tense conversations, let's take it behind closed doors. My request wasn't for him to stop yelling because, hey, that's just him. And, I had to kind of accept certain characteristics of his, but I didn't want him doing it in front of people. And by me addressing that in such an assertive way, he really did hear it. And in fact, he got better even with the yelling. By the time we were behind closed doors, he was able to speak more rationally to me. And it really worked out beautifully. I believe that he gained so much respect for me because of how I addressed that situation. The big point here in all of this is to be an active participant. Don't let other people define what's acceptable, whether we're talking about behaviors or your workload. You get to have a voice in the conversation. You get to define what works for you. You have limits, and they deserve to be respected. But no one knows what your limits are except for you. So be vocal and be honest about what you need. Flex when it's necessary, but recognize that you have a role here and you have much more power than you might think if you're willing to use it. I would love to invite you to keep in touch with me by visiting eatyourcareer.com/signup. If you enter your information on that page, you'll get an email notification letting you know about my free monthly training webinars, which are similar to this one you just watched, and also my free monthly Q&A sessions where you can submit your own career questions and other questions that you have about workplace issues, and I will address them for you. Thank you so much for attending this session. I hope you found it useful. It's truly been an honor, and I do hope that you will choose to keep in touch with me.